We're going to begin with a panel discussion, and I'm really looking forward to this panel because even at the very first urban leaders gathering in Dallas, this issue came to the forefront as something that we've got to figure this out. we got to how does classical and urban work together, right? And so I think this is the only very specifically classical education focused plenary or panel of our retreat. But I'm really looking forward to it, and it's being led by Joylynn Blake. And so let me read you Joylynn's biography here. So first thing to notice is that Joylynn just completed her doctorate. She is now Dr. Joylynn Blake. So congratulations. From Dallas Baptist University. She's a researcher in the field of classical and Christian education since 2003. Her master's thesis she completed at Regent College in Vancouver explored models of Christian education within the context of philosopher Nick Wolterstorff, epistemological and educational theories. And her recent doctoral treatise, Classical Education for the Public Good, examined 4 classical schools serving diverse student bodies in 4 states. So she and her husband Todd live in Dallas. They have 3 children, and they're active members of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowships.
While the panelists take their spot, I'll give you a brief, fuller history of my bio and how I came to be interested in both classical education and urban education specifically. My family lived and worked in China for about 8 years. And while we were there, it was part homeschooling, and as a parent, my looking at various homeschooling options and models and so forth, and gathering curriculum from here and there. And then for another portion of the time, we were at an international school working there. And at that international school, it was indeed international. It drew from all over the world, all Europe and Asia and Africa and the States. And with that constitution in that international setting, it felt, raising my own kids, normal. You know, it was the standard for normal. Then we came back to the States, and I was like, well, I guess I need to get a certification here and start working. And so I went to work at a school in the southern area of Dallas in a little suburb called Lancaster. And it was a school, Title I school, high population of urban students. And as I worked there, I found such richness in the student relationships and such poverty in the educational structures. And as we had all these meetings, I found best practice rules and ways to disaggregate the data and look at the STAR test and begin teaching with the end in mind. And there was so much of the rhetoric in the wider educational world that left me feeling like, it doesn't have to be this way, on this one hand, right? And then, as I looked for where I wanted my kids to go to school, and as I looked at what would sort of align with their homeschooling education and then their international schooling, and then what would be a natural trajectory in what they had learned and so forth. So I looked up some schools with the word classical in their names, and we toured them in Dallas and in the surrounding areas. And as we walked the halls and looked at the students and regarded the constituency, it was, as is often the accusation in the classical world, predominantly wealthy and white. And my family, with our background, felt uncomfortable and ill at ease, not at home. So on this one hand, in the public ed world, it doesn't have to be this way. And in the classical Christian world, it shouldn't be this way. those two passions came together and were more solidified in my exploring. So if I feel that a model of classical schooling can be rich, meaningful, applicable, I believe I wrote it down, what Mr. Cook said, high quality education for all children, how will those things really work together? So I'm really excited about this panel because we have educators, leaders that can hopefully speak to some of those thoughts and ideas. And so I'll just lay out kind of what we're going to do, how the panel is going to go.
I started a school in Philadelphia for boys, and it wasn't an attractive deal for the boys because it was all boys. You had to wear uniforms, strict discipline, Latin, and we also had an extended day and Saturday school. So you're right. Parents made the boys come to boys Latin because no 13-year-old boy is going to sign up to that. That's murder. But the whole premise of the school was when we started the school, it was at a time where college enrollment for African-American males in Philadelphia was at an abysmal level. And we were trying to figure out a way to get boys more interested in school. And I come with some a unique background. I came out of the education world, the alternative school world. I used to get kids who were truant, permanently expelled, troublemakers. Those are my people. And so they are my people because I was one of those people when I was in school. So that in itself was something that kind of prepared me for this because most boys don't like school. Certainly urban boys, about half of them self-identify as hating school. So we wanted to create something that was going to make them want to come, want to learn, and want to move forward. And with a lot of support and a lot of help, we were able to do that. But it is the whole point that I was a troublemaker, so I know where troublemakers come from. I know what they do. I know what causes that kind of stuff. And it makes it a little easier for me to kind of navigate through those kinds of issues.
I have done this in kind of segmented realities. So the first segment was I got involved in classical education in 1996 at a classical school in Grand Rapids, Michigan called North Hills Classical Academy. I became headmaster of that school in 1998 in the middle of the year and continued until it closed in 2010. The recession in Michigan hit very hard in 2008, and we hung on for a couple years, but then had kind of a perfect storm of negative events that closed the school, mostly financial. And so I started working at the Potter's House School. So during that time, in 2002, I think I became a member of the board of Society for Classical Learning. John Seal asked me to come on and be a board member, and I was pretty much a perpetual board member. I think I missed 1 or 2 years between 2002 and 2016, but I mean, I was pretty much on the board for about 14 years somehow. I don't know, it wasn't supposed to work that way, but it did. And then I've been on the board at CiRCE Institute, and I've been a consultant for them, a leadership consultant for the last, 9 years, I guess. I've been on the board since 2002 as well. So I've been steeped in classical education through a lot of reading and just being in classical schools, being on these national boards. I went, when I started in '96, I went to the training at Logos School in Idaho, in Moscow, Idaho, with Doug Wilson and Tom Spencer and Tom Garfield, all those guys, Matt Whitling. And so I kind of learned classical education, my first bit there, reading their books. But then my view of it expanded as I began to listen to other voices and read other books. and kind of see the classical education movement as more of a historical movement, and began reading more broadly and understanding classical education more broadly, especially in the work of David Hicks, Norms and Nobility, which has kind of become my understanding of classical education. Then the second part was, okay, so in 2010, I needed a job. And I started substituting on a maternity leave for a math teacher at Potter's House School in Grand Rapids. The Potter's House School in Grand Rapids is a very diverse school. It's about 30% African and African American, 30% Hispanic, 30% Caucasian, 10% Native American, South Pacific Islander, and other. And so very diverse school, mostly poor, mostly like above 60% free and reduced lunch, and then I'd say most of the rest of the population is just above the poverty line, so they just don't meet that threshold. Very, very different kind of education there. I brought a lot of my classical leanings with me. I did curriculum development for the Potter's House for several years, and then the last 4 years I've been the principal at the high school. I learned a lot at the Potter's House about educational injustice that Russ Gregg brought up. I learned a lot about race and racism and racialization, and what those things mean in terms of who's eligible to get an education and who isn't, and what opportunities there are and what there aren't for people in our country today. And so my work for the last 9 years has been integrating those two worlds. So trying to understand classical education and and education for people who are living in a context that has adverse and unjust circumstances. And so my work has been kind of an integration of those things the last few years. And so maybe that's all you really need to know about me right now. I'm transitioning now to work for a year for a very classical school in Orlando, Florida, the Geneva School, which I would consider a flagship classical school in the United States. But again, it's going back to a population that is more white, more privileged than the context I've been working in for the last 9 years. And I'm going there because my friend Bob Ingram, who's head of school there, needed some help in a transition, and so I'm going there to help him for a year so that he can hire the people he needs. And I'm going back to the Potter's House. At least that's the plan right now. So I'm in transition now. And next week, actually, I move to Orlando for a year. So that's what I'm going to do.
So thank you so much. Dr. Parham, I just met today, but that does not mean I have not learned something from her. Two things. One is email can be a ministry. All right, leaders. Well, in preparation for today, there was some correspondence, and Dr. Parham was able to respond concisely and personably. So it can be done, leaders, okay? She made me feel like a person. She instructed me, and she was concise, all in one. She was ministering to me through email. And secondly, just in our brief conversation before this event, I was like, what drew you to classical education? And her simple statement was, I'm drawn to tradition, and it felt in keeping with my natural constitution. And I thought that was so insightful, especially for some of the things that Dr. Gant and all of us were talking about worship, because what we have to consider is whose traditions, what traditions, testimony to what scope of tradition. That's some things I hope we get to talk about.
I guess just as a preface too, I have a few slides to share with you. I homeschool my daughters using a classical model, and then I also co-founded a classical after-school program that works with lower-income African-American children. So the context where I work is looking at bringing together the African-American tradition and classical schooling. And so I'm just going to share with you some of my thoughts about how to bring those two together. All right, so what I see are kind of three different perspectives on how these relate to each other. The first is the idea of the Western classical tradition and African-American experience being separate. The second is an active examination of African and other non-European peoples in the classical world. And a third is thinking in terms of a dialogue between the Black intellectual tradition and Western classics. And so I'm going to go through each of those briefly. So with the first perspective, the idea is that the focus is generally on studying Western history, philosophy, and literature without reference to non-European peoples, right? And the African and African-American experience are seen as unconnected, right? So that would be one of the most basic approaches. This gets into the second approach. I'm sorry, the title is cut off, but this is one where you're thinking about African and non-European peoples in the classical world and in the ancient world. And this map, it's hard to make out, but this is the world according to Herodotus. And what you would be able to see, if you could see closely, is you have Europe at the top there, and then you have kind of the Mediterranean in the middle, and then you've got a huge swath of Africa that's labeled as Libya and Ethiopia, because Ethiopia was often stood in kind of for much of the continent. And you have Arabia and Asia. Right? So just thinking about how Herodotus and his writings, you certainly have people who are non-European. Also, just to build on that map and thinking about some of the classical writers and where were non-European peoples. So this is from a book called Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, written by a classicist, a professional classicist. And what she does in this book, it's incredibly helpful, is she's combed through all of this classical writing, looking specifically where there are mentions of non-European peoples, from India, from the Middle East, from Africa, and so on. And so I've just excerpted a few of them. So this first one is from the Odyssey, where Menelaus describes to Telemachus his journey home from the Trojan War, and you see some of the different places that he traveled to. So this is just saying, you know, certainly it was on the consciousness of people writing at the time. This next quote is a really interesting one from Pliny the Elder from Natural Histories. And I won't read through the whole thing, you can read it, but I'll just kind of summarize. It's very interesting. So many of the writers in the ancient world, they had this kind of environmental theory about why peoples looked the way they did. And so Ethiopians, they saw as being very dark because of the sun. But then you'll notice he talks about very light-colored people who were white, and he puts those at polar opposites, and he doesn't see either of them as ideal. You know, so the people who are white are wild, and then the people who are darker are lackluster. And the ideal people are the people in the middle. So more kind of the Mediterranean, you'll see they are the ones that he sees have gentle customs, right? And so it's, you know, it's very interesting because in our context, we, you know, often white is going to be the better and black is going to be the worst, but that's not, you know, that's not necessarily the case for what Pliny is seeing is, well, it's the people in the middle who are best, and he's working off of this kind of environmental theory, right? So again, it just gives us kind of sociologically a sense of they were trying to figure this out and see, you know, how do people come to be different? And then the last one I'll share with you, this is from Herodotus' Histories, where he's making the case that the Greeks borrowed some of their clothing from the Libyans in North Africa, right? So this is, you know, kind of an alternative approach of looking at where were the places of African and other non-European peoples in the thinking of Western Europeans. Then the last approach, and again, the top is cut off, but this is that final approach of the Black intellectual tradition in dialogue with the Western classics. And so for this one, particularly in the context of the United States, the dominance of classical education in pre and post emancipation, that was the kind of education that you were often going to get if you were going to get an education. So for African Americans pre-emancipation who were struggling to get an education, this is typically what they were going to be getting, right? So what you find is some very creative Black intellectual engagement with the Western classics. You also find a lot of intellectual and artistic innovation. So that is not just, kind of mimicking what Western classics is doing, but creatively and critically engaging with that tradition, innovating on it, and so on. And what the last point is that by teaching a kind of dialogue between the Black intellectual tradition and Western classics, you really get to weave together a study of both. And so you're looking at Black literature, artistic traditions, and you're looking at how they've been in dialogue with the Western classical tradition for hundreds of years in very innovative ways. So just a couple of examples. Phyllis Wheatley, who is a classical prodigy, really, and she's the first published African-American poet in the United States. Really fascinating. So that's one kind of figure that would be an example of what I'm talking about. Another, of course, is Frederick Douglass, who really learned oratory studying the kind of classical rhetoric that was in vogue at the time and really self-educated. And one of the things that was in the Columbian Orator, which he studied very intensively, was this dialogue between a master and a slave. Now, this was not meant for Black people to be reading, but this is what he was reading. And as he's looking at this dialogue, he said, it is teaching him about freedom and ideas of freedom and yearning for freedom. And he talks about how it opened up his soul to be able to read and to really think through issues of liberation and freedom. And the last example I'll give you is Romare Bearden's Black Odyssey, which Danielle introduced me to a number of years ago and I've used in my program in the community. Romare Bearden is a 20th century Black artist who has this really brilliant kind of Black reinterpretation of the Odyssey. And so I've used that in my program in the community. And I've also, this year, we went through the Greek myths, and I commissioned a young African-American artist to do a creative reinterpretation of the Greek gods and goddesses as African-American. And I have examples of that I'll pass around in just a moment. And so we read through the Greek myths, and then we used these images of the different gods and goddesses to prompt the children to write poetry based on what they knew of these different figures. So this is what I think of as a kind of a third approach to thinking about a dialogue back and forth. When I say the Black intellectual tradition, there is this very serious tradition of Black scholarship and inquiry and writing that is in its own sense, another tradition that's very important. And I'm aware I'm only focusing on the African American tradition, and that's mostly because that's where I am standing and that's who I am working with. I know people are working with very diverse populations, but at least this gives you kind of one approach that, three different approaches for this particular population. So I will pass these little booklets around. Feel free to take a look at what the kids have done.
I did begin classical education through homeschooling my children. And it was because of, in New Orleans, pre-Hurricane Katrina, our school system, and it continues to be a struggle to get your children into a good school, and it begins very early, at the age of 2, even, to get into a decent elementary school. And because I was aware of the system and how it worked, I was able to navigate the ropes of the system. But it was through that navigation of the system that I realized that it was inherently unjust. Even our private school system, we have a very strong tradition of private schools, Catholic and non-Catholic schools in New Orleans. And so the one of my choosing, I admired very much. They used the core knowledge curriculum, and they had implemented it very well, beautifully. They had an art studio with powder wheels and the whole 9 yards. But what I noticed in that school was that there was one Black student in each classroom. And in New Orleans, where 60% of the population is black, that's very much intentional. And the school was wonderfully welcoming. They offered me a job, or your children can go here for free. But then I realized, well, what good would it be for just me and my children? What about the other students, the other children? And then why would I want to put my child in a place where he was cherry-picked to be the only one? And I couldn't submit myself or my children to the realities of that. And so I kind of was, it really forced my husband to accept homeschooling, which I wanted to do anyway. And so, but in homeschooling, so what should we do and what should we use and how should we go about it? And in our journey of homeschooling, I was introduced to, through college, I knew about Marva Collins in Chicago. I very much admired her school and her book and the movies about her. I very much admired Ed Hirsch in his cultural literacy writings and the idea of a core knowledge of all Americans should have a certain standard, a level of education. I truly admired that. I also had admired the writings of William Bennette at the time. I think he had a book, I forgot the name of his book, but it was something like something about schools and the standard of schools. So I truly appreciated the traditional approach to education and that there is a standard that we should have, that all people should know, different things we should know about. But then when I went to put that education into practice and through books like The Well-Trained Mind, Susan Bauer Wise, I realized very quickly that we would never encounter ourselves in the way that I really wanted to. And we joined classical conversations to really learn more about the classical model and be in community with others. And then I would also research online and came across an Aryan website that said classical education is best because it's the widest education you can give your child. And it had a list of curriculum options where you would never encounter a person of color. And on that website, and that curriculum, this was a curriculum that's in wide use in most Christian schools and homeschooling programs, which was very disturbing and very true. It was just true. And it was a forum, so you could see the discussion of this on the open website, which I thought, wow, that's very brave. And so, and so as I grew and persisted in my understanding of classical education, is this a white thing? Is this only for white people? Because I truly appreciated the idea of what Ed Hirsch was saying, and I thought his program, his scope and sequence was inclusive. But as a mother at home with 6 children, how can I possibly teach all these children these different levels and different things, and then find a school even that will represent all these people and all these children at one time? And so through reading Norms and Nobility, through CiRCE Institute apprenticeship program, and really discussing, well, what is a Christian classical education? And how should this look? And realizing the importance of normative questions, of a prescriptive education, of having these conversations, and even learning the definition. And I love Peter's first year at SCL, well, the first year we did the Urban Institute, he had a breakout session that caused a lot of ruckus at the conference after our urban leadership retreat, just by asking a question of giving the definition of what is a classical education. This is what Norm says, David Hicks' books, that classical education is not preeminently of a specific time or place. It stands instead for a spirit of inquiry and a form of instruction concerned with the development of style through language and conscious through myth. And so Peter asked the question, well, if that's the definition, then what should we read? Should we expand the canon? And the room kind of exploded. Why should we have to change what we're going to read? Why can't they read this and that? And it was really eye-opening. And it led me to think think truly about it and reevaluate a classical education. If you look at the catalogs, it's about Greece and Rome. We always start there. It's about the Western tradition, which is what is the Western tradition? How would we define Western? Those things come to mind. And so it led me to ask the questions of, well, it's about inquiry, like, well, who do we say our students are? Because oftentimes in an urban classical education, the emphasis starts to become about behavior, discipline, dress codes, things that have nothing to do with the spirit of inquiry and a form of instruction that develops language. It starts to challenge, like, who do you say your students are? And that, what are the natures of these children? Are they of a different kind? Because often the classical schools in the white areas are radically different from those in the black areas. And it becomes an issue of external forces, not truly development of virtue and wisdom. It's not the focus in urban areas often. And then the second thing is the form, like how. How should we educate children? And the how is often different between the suburban schools and the urban schools. And I think it always refers back to who do we say the students are. And then, that's the scripture. Who do we say? Jesus asked the apostles, who do you say I am? So I ask the educators, who do you say our students are? And then the second question is, what good does it gain the whole world and yet forfeit your souls for our students? So if the how is different between the two groups, and the emphasis is more on college preparatory, the emphasis is on job preparation, the emphasis on external things, and not on the cultivation of virtue and wisdom. Really, it's across the board. In the suburban schools, we tend to fall back on that too, because it's how do we keep our students prosperous? How do we make leaders? And it's truly oftentimes not tied to how to cultivate virtue and wisdom. It's not the primary thing. And then the third question that makes me, what we have to think about is what? And I realized in the past two conferences, the question I was like, what books do you recommend? What black books should we read? And that really is the third thing. It's not the primary thing. Because I realized that this education should be liberating in the fact that we're fitting children to know the truth, and the truth shall set them free, and to know who they are in Christ, primary and first. That you are a child of God made in his image and likeness, first and primary. That's the root of it all. And that is through being able to perceive and discern truth that you shall be set free. And being rooted in who you are in Christ, and that we are developing an education to fit us to imitate Christ. That we must not lose sight of that. So in my homeschooling journey, with my own children and trying to navigate these different paths, and then just learning and growing in classical education, becoming a consultant for schools, is seeing that oftentimes we focus on the wrong things. And then as the children are growing to maturity, that they're not fit, even though they have read the right books, even though they've been in a smaller environment, even though they've been discipled their whole lives, and they're still falling short and being human. And so that I have really focused on, and we need to show children how they fit in the timeline, in the place of salvation history, by showing them the interrelationships of people, places throughout time, and the paradox and tension within. So yes, especially in urban areas, of how do we can't even talk about Thomas Jefferson without getting into major debate of the founding fathers or anything of the country without tremendous debate. And how does it fit together? How do I fit into that story? And how do I fit into God's plan? And so and also that education truly is a transmission of culture and of heritage. And we have truly lived and continue to live in segregated realities. And so how do we show that all of mankind's history begins in the garden? I remember I said one time, like, Black history begins in the garden of, in the Garden of Eden. I wanted to say Eve, and I'm like, it's not Eve. And somebody thought that was really amazing. I was like, where do you think Black people came from? Like, all the peoples have the same origin and beginning. And so how do we relate those, the people and the places, ideas, knowing that, yes, we should be seeking in development with truth, beauty, and goodness, but it hasn't always been all good for all of the people. It hasn't been all beautiful for all the people, and the truth has been denied for most people. So you can't, like this year in my own homeschooling, it's just realizing that we have to, it's nuanced. It's more complicated than we try to make it seem, and that there is a role of paradox, and how do I have conversations about paradox with children? And that is I found that the parable of the wheat and the tares is the greatest story for that, because we always start with story, right? And that there will be wheat and tares in ourselves, in our society, in our families, and how do we choose what's good? And at the root of it, that's what classical education helps us to do.
So here are the 3 questions. The first is, how does your student demographic inform your school's ecosystem? Let that marinate. The ecosystem being, it could be anything. It could be the curriculum you choose, the pedagogy you use. It could be the financial structure that you design. It could be the atmosphere that you seek to cultivate. I'm using the term school, but you understand what I mean, the ministry that you're actively engaged in. So how does your student demographic inform your school's ecosystem? These are good questions for all of you to consider as well. Secondly, why classical? How do you define your school as a classical? And I think we've already spoken to that briefly, but why? Like, if we're concerned with representation, seeing faces, things with which we can identify, and we've admitted that those things are largely absent in the longstanding classical tradition, that it has been narrowly defined and expressed in the predominantly white world, then why bother? Why bother? Why try to marry these things? And I think Dr. Parham kind of spoke to that, in that we're not really trying to marry them. We're pulling out what has long been there. Okay? And the third question is, comment on what has proven to be a significant or perhaps surprising element in accomplishing your mission. Again, what has been a significant or a surprising element in accomplishing your mission that maybe you didn't know to predict in advance, but you've discovered, this has proven to be pretty crucial or important. Okay. Any votes from the crowd? 1, 2, or 3 of those questions that you want addressed? 1, we're having a vote for 1.
I mean, I think going from a kind of traditional classical school to a school that is more diverse, I think that the population very much informs the ecosystem. I think that the ecosystem in a school that is diverse, or a school that is even kind of culturally monolithic, but of a different culture than kind of white America, informs the ecosystem a lot. I mean, the way that your school functions, the kind of literature that you want to look at and study, the kind of history that you and your perspective on history is very different. I mean, just like Danielle was saying, in a white classical school, talking about Thomas Jefferson isn't a problem. In a black school, talking about Thomas Jefferson brings up a lot of issues and debates that you're not going to have in a white, all white school. So I think the things that you notice are different too, and the things that you have to be conscientious of as a teacher are different. And so I think that there are a lot of ways that those things speak to each other. I mean, one of the things that I point out to my students, I teach theology, and I taught theology at both schools. When I was at a white classical school, I never pointed out that Augustine was African. The person that I consider to be the greatest theologian who ever lived was an African. And I point that out to my students in my context now every year. I say the greatest theologian, in my estimation, who ever lived was African, not Caucasian. He's part of the driving force of the Western tradition, and he was an African. Just so you know, too, my daughter has some medical problems, and we did a 23andMe test on her to find out where our ancestors came from. My earliest ancestors came from East Africa. I just want you to know that I originated in East Africa somehow. So I look Dutch and white, but I'm really way back. I'm really African too. We all are, right? We all. So right. So I think that the ecosystem of the school, I think that the way things work relationally very much are a product of the cultural dynamics that you have in the school, and so the schools are going to look different and act different because of the, and I think I'm not saying anything profound. I think you all know that. So I think that the student population, the student demographic, informs the ecosystems in a lot of ways.
I think the discussion of Thomas Jefferson should elicit the same kind of discussions in a white school as the black school. And I think we do that by focusing on primary causes and what is. So the biggest thing about Thomas Jefferson was he was a slave owner, right? And then how do we deal with that issue? That should be something that white students discuss and think about as well. Because surprisingly, in a lot of classical circles among adults, so I've been in these classical circles for almost 20 years now, and I used to be the only black person in the room. And people feel very free, they freely talk when there's only one black person in the room. So I've heard slavery talked about in a very romanticized, mythologized, Disney-fied kind of way. For the first time in my life, and the northern aggression and all these types of things. This year I did a consultation at a school in Louisiana with the rebels, the mascot of the rebels, and on the school sign is a Confederate flag, the battle flag, and it was a segregation academy. Like, the school was started as a Christian school, bought the only black school in the parish to keep segregation intact, and they're trying to convert to a classical school. It's the same group of people from 1970. And it went back to, if we focused on, as I presented them a lesson on African history that they didn't know it was going to be about, but I told them if we followed a classical model or a classical lesson, so I used a mimetic lesson to introduce them to talk about Ghana, West Africa. And so I prepared them to receive that knowledge by saying, what is an empire? We had a discussion about empire, which someone said, well, it's a nation, but then it was a debate on whether or not the United States is truly a nation, because a nation means one kind of people. So America is not truly a nation because there is not one just kind of people, which is an interesting conversation to have. But then talked about the 11th century, and then I read them the story about Ghana. And then the logos of the lesson was just about empires in general. And that the story led them to make a lot of connections and discussions that we didn't have because that wasn't the focus. The focus was on primary causes and what is, but they still was engaged and challenged. And so I think schools need to look at sort of student demographics. If you focus on primary causes and what is, so like for us, reading Up From Slavery was just not a story about Black people and slavery. It's the question of dignity. What is dignity? And using that as a theme the whole year on dignity. And that applies to all people in all times and all places, and the difference between information and formation in our education. So our student demographics and our ecosystem of the school should be one that nurtures and facilitates and encourages inquiry using normative questioning of all topics.
I think that's an important point, that the fact that we have different demographics, I think, shapes the way our ecosystems work, but the same questions and that goal of human flourishing, should be the same, and we should have the same debates, conversations, dialogues in any kind of school, but often that's not what happens.
Well, in my school's all male and 97, 98% African American. And so we are intentional about what we teach. We want to do things that are going to increase their level of scholarship. We want to challenge them, and we want to increase their level of scholarship. We also want to be able to discuss things that you normally can't discuss in a co-ed environment. Boys are a lot more open in a single gender environment, and you can introduce more subjects to them, more topics to them, and have them speak freely about them. Even the things like our literature. We read Shakespeare, but we read The Merchant of Venice, we read Julius Caesar, we read Shakespearean speeches about revenge, because boys want to know about revenge. That's something they care about, how you get that person back, how you feel about that. And so we really focus on those types of things. Certainly in approaching classical material, there are certainly things that are focused, locked in on race because of where a lot of that stuff took place. What we try and do is go up over that and figure out what are the bigger ideas that come from that apply to what we do today. There's no reason to study 2,000 years ago just to know what happened 2,000 years ago. You have to know how that affects you today. What happened then, what did that make, how did that make things different today? And are we seeing some of those same problems? Have we been able to solve them? We want to get them to think more globally and more expansively about the world. And that's what that was our motivation in bringing in classical education. We always say we pick Latin because it's hard, okay? And there was a little bit of that too. I mean, because really, you have to study. You have to do your homework. If you don't, you're going to be in trouble. But that's true in any subject. But if we could have Latin to be that gateway to get them to understand that, to wrap their head around that concept, then we've used Latin, we've used classical studies to turn students into, turn regular guys into students. The whole idea of being an African-American male and being heavily engaged in school, doing your homework, wanting to stay extra to talk to the teacher, these are concepts that don't happen in regular public school. In fact, a lot of the schools that my boys would have gone to don't even look like a school. They're like crazy places. So the whole idea of bringing in Latin, classical studies, that type of thing, is to try to create an environment where there's order. Not force it on them teach them to appreciate it. Order isn't something that you put on students. Order is something that they learn to absorb, self-control. We're not out to control them, we're out to teach them self-control. And if you can control yourself, you can control your life, you can control your environment, you can control anything. And so, yes, we are probably more traditional classic school than most. We chose that path, and we actually compete with the classical schools around in our community. We go to Curtamens. I don't know if you guys do that down here. We do Curtamens, which is a Latin competition. We win Curtamens. There's no other school of black boys who go out and win statewide competitions on an academic level. And we do it with Latin. And that has changed perception. It's changed a whole lot of things. And it's made these guys willing to go out and take chances and step out of their environment, step out of their comfort zone. We're real big on that. If you're comfortable in it, you're not learning anything. You have to get out of your comfort zone. So we use these things to try and address some of the problems that we see that are inherent in urban education. And for guys coming out of urban education into a different environment, we've got to give them a pathway into that environment. And we've used classical education and Latin to do that.
We're just a couple minutes over time, but I want to give Ms. Parham a chance to share some last thoughts.
So I wanted to address together the why classical and the demographic question. And I think building on part of what you said, Danielle, about how it's important for, I think, everyone to be engaged in these debates, I think also having, whether the population is mainly white or mainly African American, looking back to see the role of African peoples from the ancient world through today is incredibly important, because we're led to believe that we didn't do anything. You know, whereas you can see different cultures in the ancient world drawing from African peoples and cultures, and it's incredibly important that black, white, you know, everyone knows that. Because I am, you know, almost 50, but I am still surprised at what I am learning that I didn't know, and I feel cheated. You know, I feel cheated that I don't know it. I know that it shaped my self-concept, and I can only imagine what it would have done for me to know this as a child and to just know it. And I think that's incredibly important. The other thing that I would say is when I'm thinking of classical, I'm thinking of it in the larger context also of, you know, what is it that classical African civilizations have contributed? So part of what I told you, Joylynn, that I'm just drawn to tradition in general. I like to be deeply rooted. I think it's important for people to be deeply rooted rather than going back and forth from one, you know, kind of educational fad to another. If our ancestors, black, white, in between, have spent these hundreds of years developing something well, why wouldn't we want to take advantage of that? That's not to say everything they did was great, but being discerning about what they did, that is incredibly enriching. I want to know that. So for instance, one of the things I'm trying to figure out how to bring to the kids in my community is African dance and drumming. My own daughters have been in African dance for many years, and I continue to be astounded at the complexity of the many different dancing and drumming traditions. It is astounding. We have little boys, they start when they're 4 years old learning these drumming traditions. From the outside, when you look at, say, historical European writers, looking from the outside in, they just see it as a lot of noise. But when you are in those circles, and I've sat through these rehearsals for about 6 or 7 years now, there are very complex drumming patterns. There are complex communication systems to tell you when to change, which steps, which songs go with it. They have all different purposes. And these little boys learn from when they're 3 or 4, and they can call to mind then when they are older men. I mean, there've got to be hundreds of these patterns. It is beautiful. And then the girls and their dances and their steps, you know, when we're somewhere or I'm hearing something on TV, I'll ask my daughters, okay, so what dance is that? You know, what step is that? What tradition is that from? So to be able to do that, to be able to discern and to hear and to know this is something that in different parts of the continent has been going on for hundreds of years, and you can be proud of that and see also some of how that complexity has informed African American music and American music in general, not just African American music, but all kinds of music here. So I think that importance of tradition from many different cultural backgrounds is incredibly important and empowering for our young people.
One of the things that I think why classical is an important question, I think it's both easy to answer and difficult to answer. I think it's easy to answer because for me, I think that classical education is the best way to educate young people. It's difficult to answer because I think it comes with a lot of baggage, and I think a lot of people look at classical education and it has a negative connotation. I think that's something that Eric Cook really impressed on me a couple years ago when he was talking to national leaders in education about classical education, and the primary observation from those educational leaders was almost uniformly negative. That classical education is not a positive thing for many reasons. But a couple things that I think, a couple reasons why I think it is good and why it is important is that I think it is basically an education that's based on inquiry, and that we are teaching people to have a genuine intellectual curiosity. It is also an education that is based on wisdom and virtue. It's an education that is humanizing. And Brian Williams, recently I heard him actually when I was down at Geneva. He's at Eastern College, and he's kind of formulating this idea, and it was the first time I'd heard it, and I thought it was really good, and I want to share it with you. Education is one of those things that we haven't gotten better at. Okay, there are a lot of things in our world that people get better at. I think that the cars that are being produced now in 2019 are a lot better than the cars that were being produced in 1960, 1950. They're a lot safer, they're a lot faster, they get a lot better gas mileage. They're just better. We make better cars now. Nobody's writing better plays than Shakespeare wrote. And nobody is composing better music than Bach or Beethoven. Those are things that are classical because people look at those and they say those are really the kind of the top of their game. I mean, people just aren't better than that. Classical education is worthwhile because it's the best way to do it, and we have not improved on that in education. Education in the 20th century, in the 21st century, didn't get better. It didn't improve on the education that was offered in the first century, or even before the first century. And so so that idea, I think that Brian Williams brought out, was something that I thought was really valuable, and hopefully he'll write about it, and you can hear more about it later.
Why don't we give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much, Joylynn, as well, for facilitating. This has been so thought-provoking and engaging.